The rain drummed against my dash, a steady pulse in the dark. On my tablet's thermal feed, a bright white ghost moved across my lawn with predatory stillness. It was Becky. She was hunched over my flower bed with a measuring tape, likely checking if my mulch was a half-inch deeper than the aesthetic code allowed. In my old life at the Treasury, I tracked men who moved millions through shell companies. I thought I knew what a predator looked like. Then I moved to Willow Creek and met Becky Williamson. She'd started with a welcome that felt like a shakedown for my bedroom. When I gave her a hard no, the flirting stopped and the firing squad started. Now I was the unstable threat, the shark trying to bankrupt his neighbors. I tapped a key. A second window snapped open. Line 16. Miscellaneous fees. Red numbers pulsed. A $87,400 discrepancy Becky thought she'd buried. Outside, a muffled thwack thwack echoed as she stapled another fine to my front door. "Keep stapling, Becky," I whispered. "Every orange slip is just another exhibit in the million-dollar hole I am digging for you." I hovered my cursor over the send button to fill, the first domino in a chain reaction. Becky told me she was the waves in this neighborhood. She was about to find out I was the seawall. I hit the key. 10 doors down, Phil's porch light flicked on. The audit had begun. "Hi, I'm Cameron Jackson. I spent 30 years in windowless rooms at the Treasury, untangling the kind of financial webs that make people jump off ledges. I moved to Willow Creek for a quiet retirement, but I quickly realized that a woman with a clipboard and a grudge can be just as dangerous as a cartel boss with a shell company. Thanks for listening to my story, and if you like it, a like and subscribe would really help me get stories like this out to." The moving van was still hissing air from its brakes when I first saw her. Willow Creek looked exactly like the brochure promised. A sea of identical gabled roofs, manicured fescue, and a silence so profound it felt expensive. I'd spent 30 years in the windowless offices of the IRS and private firms, untangling the kind of financial webs that make people jump off ledges. This house, a 4-bedroom colonial with approved slate gray shutters, was my reward. It was meant to be a quiet, boring corner of the world where the only thing I'd have to audit was my own cholesterol. I was leaning into the back of the truck, wrestling with a box of kitchenware that rattled with every shift, when a shadow fell across the sun-baked driveway. "You must be Cameron, 42, single and formerly with the Treasury. Am I right?" I straightened up too fast, my skull clipping the metal roof of the van. I turned, rubbing the back of my head, nearly dropping a stack of ceramic plates. Standing there was a woman who looked like she'd been professionally polished by a team of specialists. Her blonde hair was a structural marvel of hairspray and precision highlights, and her sundress was a shade of eggshell that I would later learn was the only approved exterior accent color for Category A residences. "I'm Becky Williamson," she said, stepping into my personal space with a smile that was a fraction too wide, showing teeth that were blindingly white. "President of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, but you can just call me the boss." She laughed, a sharp, practiced sound that didn't quite reach her eyes, and reached out to brush a speck of cardboard dust off my forearm. The contact lingered several seconds too long, her thumb grazing my skin in a way that felt decidedly unneighborly. "I did a little digging once your escrow opened," she continued, her eyes scanning me from my work boots to my hairline with an intensity that made me feel like a ledger she was trying to balance. "We don't get many men like you in the creek. Most of the husbands here are, well, soft, corporate types who fold at the first sign of a stern memo. You look like you know how to handle a bit of pressure, Cameron." "Just looking for some peace and quiet, Becky," I said, gently stepping back to create a respectable buffer of air. "The house passed the inspection, and I've read the CC&Rs cover to cover, twice. I don't plan on making any waves." "Oh, Cameron," she purred, tucking a stray hair behind her ear, and leaning in close enough for me to smell a heavy, cloying scent of lilies and expensive gin. "In this neighborhood, I am the waves." and I think you and I are going to be seeing a lot of each other. I personally oversee the transition of every new resident. It's a hands-on process." She winked. It wasn't subtle. It was a physical assault on the concept of professionalism. "In fact," she said, her voice dropping an octave, "why don't you come over to the clubhouse tonight? Around 8? I'll give you a private tour of the facilities. Just the two of us. We can go over the intimate details of the bylaws. There are certain perks to being on the board's good side that aren't exactly in the handbook. I've spent my life looking for red flags in tax returns, and Becky Williamson was a walking, talking audit risk." I gave her a tight, polite smile, the kind I used to give to nervous corporate VPs before I told them their offshore accounts had been flagged. "I think I'll be pretty busy unpacking tonight, Becky. And honestly, I've had my fill of private tours for one lifetime." Becky's smile didn't falter, but her eyes flickered with something cold and sharp, like a shutter closing on a bright room. The flirtatious warmth vanished, replaced by the predatory stillness of someone used to being obeyed. "Of course," she said, her voice regaining its brittle presidential clip. "But don't worry, Cameron, I'm very persistent. When I want something for this community, I always get it. And right now, I want you to feel very, very welcome." As she turned to strut down my driveway, she stopped abruptly and pointed a manicured finger at my mailbox. "The flag is at a 45-degree angle, Cameron. Section 4, paragraph B of the Aesthetics Code states it should be at exactly 40 degrees when retracted. I'll let it slide. For today, consider it a housewarming gift." I watched her walk away, her heels clicking rhythmically against the asphalt like a countdown. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I had moved here to escape the stress of the hunt, but looking at the way Becky looked back over her shoulder at me, I realized the hunter had just found a new hobby. The first week in Willow Creek felt like being under a microscope with a cracked lens. I spent my days unboxing my life, strategically placing my old mahogany desk and heavy oak filing cabinets in the spare room I designated as my home office. Through the horizontal slats of the blinds, I'd occasionally catch a glimpse of a white Lexus SUV crawling past my driveway at 5 miles per hour, the vehicular equivalent of a shark circling a cage. Becky wasn't just patrolling, she was surveying the perimeter. I could almost feel her mental ledger updating every time she saw a box labeled of financial records or a stray piece of bubble wrap on the lawn. I'd hoped my hard no at the moving van had landed with the finality of a closed case. I was wrong. In Becky's world, no wasn't a rejection. It was an opening gambit in a game she'd never lost. The inspections started on Tuesday. At 9:45 p.m., an hour designed to find a single man in his loungewear, a sharp, authoritative rap echoed through the quiet house. I opened the door, still clutching a half-empty roll of packing tape, to find Becky standing under the porch light. She was clad in a silk jogging suit that looked far too expensive for actual exercise and held a leather-bound clipboard like a medieval shield. "Cameron," she said, her voice dropping into that low, practiced purr that set my teeth on edge. "I couldn't help but notice your porch light from the street. It's a soft white LED, isn't it?" "It is," I replied, leaning against the doorframe to block her view of the messy foyer. "Energy efficient, high lumens, fits the aesthetic, I thought." "It's 3,000 kelvins, honey," she whispered, stepping past the threshold before I could even think about inviting her in. She stood in my foyer, her eyes raking over the half-unpacked boxes of tax law journals as if looking for contraband. The Willow Creek Architectural Code specifies 2,700. It's just a tiny bit too clinical, too investigative. It doesn't quite capture the suburban warmth I'm trying to cultivate in this cul-de-sac. She turned back to me, the proximity forcing me to look down at her. She reached out, her fingers straightening the collar of my t-shirt. They lingered against the heat of my neck, cold and possessive. "I have a box of the correct amber-hued bulbs at my place," she said, her thumb tracing the line of my jaw. "Why don't you walk over? We could swap them out." And maybe share a bottle of that 2018 Malbec I saw you carrying in during the move. I have a very fine opener, and I hate drinking alone. I took a deliberate, heavy step back, my spine hitting the edge of a packing crate. This was the moment. The soft rejection hadn't worked, so I had to use the forensic one. "Becky, let's stop the charade," I said, my voice flat and professional. "I'm flattered by the attention, but I'm going to be very clear. I moved here for solitude. I'm not looking for a relationship, a fling, or even a special friendship with the board president. I'm a man who likes his boundaries clearly defined. Please, keep our interactions limited to official HOA business." The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. For a split second, the polished boss disappeared, replaced by a woman whose pride was a live wire. Her eyes narrowed, the pupils constricting into dark, angry pinpricks that made her look 10 years older. "Solitude is a very expensive luxury in Willow Creek, Cameron," she said, her voice now a brittle, dangerous edge that could have sliced glass. "And following the rules? That's entirely subjective. I'm the one who decides what warmth looks like. I'm the one who decides who fits in and who stands out." She scribbled something on her clipboard with a violent flourish of her pen. "Change the bulb by tomorrow night. Or don't. But don't say I didn't try to make this easy for you. I offered you the keys to the kingdom, Cameron. Most men would kill for that seat at my table." She marched out, the scent of her lilies hanging in the air like a chemical spill. The next morning, I found a bright yellow slip tucked under my windshield wiper, fluttering in the breeze like a warning flag. Violation. Unauthorized exterior illumination. Fine, $50. Underneath the printed text, in loopy, aggressive handwriting that looked like it had been carved into the paper, was a note. "I'm still waiting for that glass of wine. Don't be difficult, Cameron. It doesn't suit a man of your stature. See you at the Saturday BBQ." I looked at the ticket, then at the white Lexus idling at the end of the street, its tinted windows reflecting the morning sun. I'd spent my career tracking people who thought they were above the law because they held the ledger. Becky Williamson thought she held the ledger of my life. She had no idea that I was already looking for the eraser. The Willow Creek annual spring BBQ was held in the common green, a stretch of grass so perfectly level it looked like it had been laid with a spirit level. I didn't want to go. Every instinct told me to stay inside, pull the blinds, and continue cross-referencing the HOA's mysterious landscaping contingency fund against the local property records. But in a neighborhood like this, absence wasn't just noted, it was an admission of guilt. I arrived with a store-bought potato salad, checked against the approved potluck index Becky had emailed out at 2 a.m., and tried to blend into the background. It didn't work. Becky was at the center of the green, wearing a sundress the color of a warning sign and holding a megaphone like a scepter. When she saw me, her eyes didn't spark with the predatory warmth of the week before. They were cold, calculating lenses. "Oh, look, everyone, our newest resident, Cameron Jackson," she announced, her voice amplified and echoing off the brick facades. "The man who thinks our lighting codes are optional." A few neighbors chuckled nervously. I felt a dozen pairs of eyes track me. Becky stepped off the small wooden dais and glided toward me, a glass of Chardonnay in one hand and a stack of new member orientation folders in the other. "I was just telling the Miller family about your background, Cameron," she said, her voice dropping just enough so only the surrounding circle could hear. "Treasury Department, wasn't it? Such a high-stress world. It's no wonder you're having a little trouble, adjusting to a community that values cooperation over interrogation." She turned to a young couple standing nearby, Phil and his wife, Sarah. "Cameron is a bit of a lone wolf, Phil. He actually told me he moved here for solitude. Can you imagine? In Willow Creek?" Phil gave me a sympathetic, if wary, nod. "Hard to find peace and quiet anywhere these days, I suppose." "There's a difference between peace and being antisocial, Phil," Becky snapped, her smile tightening. She turned back to me, her voice a sharp whisper. "I've had 3 calls this morning about your cluttered garage. Apparently, having moving boxes visible from the street for more than 72 hours is a visual blight. I've already filed the paperwork. That's another $100, Cameron." "The boxes are being picked up on Monday, Becky," I said, my voice steady, though I could feel the familiar heat of a forensic audit rising in my chest. "And as for the antisocial comment, I'm happy to chat. Just not about my porch bulbs." Becky leaned in, the smell of her floral perfume now sour with the scent of cheap wine. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Hiding behind your ledgers? But in this neighborhood, I am the audit. I've already talked to the board about a fitness of character review. We have a clause, Cameron. We can make life very, very difficult for people who don't mesh with our values." She walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with my potato salad. For the rest of the afternoon, I was a ghost. People I had waved to earlier now found reasons to look at their phones or adjust their grill covers when I approached. Becky was working the room like a politician, leaning into hushed huddles and pointing toward my house. By the time I walked back to my driveway, a fresh orange slip was taped to my front door. Becky wanted to audit my character? Fine. I was going to audit her soul. If the BBQ was a warning shot, the following week was a full-scale siege. I woke up on Monday morning to the sound of a plastic scraper against glass. I ran to the window just in time to see a flash of blonde hair disappearing behind the hedge of my neighbor's property. When I got to my car, a neon orange sticker was plastered directly onto the driver's side window, the kind with the industrial-grade adhesive that requires a gallon of solvent to remove. Violation: unauthorized overnight street parking. Fine, $150. My car wasn't in the street. It was in my driveway, or rather, the rear bumper was overhanging the sidewalk by approximately 2 inches. Becky hadn't just measured it, she'd photographed it with a digital level. I looked at the timestamp on the printout tucked into the plastic sleeve, 3 to 14 a.m. The woman wasn't sleeping. She was haunting the cul-de-sac like a vengeful spirit in a designer tracksuit. By Wednesday, the nuisance citations began to arrive in clusters, delivered by a bored-looking courier who seemed to have my address on speed dial. I was fined $200 for audible domestic disturbance because my television, tuned to a documentary on the Great Depression, was supposedly excessively resonant at 8 p.m. Was fined $75 for improper waste receptacle orientation because my wheelie bin was angled at 30 degrees toward the curb instead of being perfectly perpendicular. The total was climbing toward $2,000, and I hadn't even been in the house for a month. Becky wasn't just trying to annoy me anymore, she was trying to bleed me dry. I spent my evenings in what I now called the war room, the spare bedroom where my mahogany desk was buried under a blizzard of spreadsheets, bank statements, and public records. My forensic training was screaming, there's a rhythm to fraud, a certain stutter in the numbers that reveals a human hand trying to smooth out the edges of a lie. I'd started cross-referencing the HOA's Drainage Maintenance Fund with the actual county records for Willow Creek. According to the HOA's official 2024 year-end report, the community had paid $40,000 to a company called Apex Flow Solutions for emergency culvert clearing and hydrostatic testing. I spent 4 hours on the Secretary of State's business database. Apex Flow Solutions had been registered 18 months ago. The registered agent? Robert Bobby Vance, Becky's brother-in-law. The business address a virtual mailbox in a strip mall 3 towns over that shared a wall with a dry cleaner. There were no trucks, no equipment, and no record of Apex ever performing work for any other municipality. It was a classic pass-through entity, a vacuum designed to suck up member dues and spit them into Becky's personal orbit. As I sat there, the blue light of my dual monitors reflecting off my glasses, a sudden flash of movement caught my eye outside. I froze. I reached over and tapped the power button on my monitors, plunging the room into darkness. I crept to the window and peeled back a single slat of the blinds, just enough to see the silver glow of the moon hitting my front lawn. There she was. Becky was standing in the shadows of the Japanese maples at the edge of my property, dressed in a dark, tactical-looking fleece. She wasn't holding a clipboard this time. She had a high-powered thermal monocular pressed to her eye, aimed directly at my home office window. She was looking for heat signatures, proof of multiple computers, or a server rack that would allow her to cite me for commercial activity in a residential zone. That carried a $500 a day penalty and a mandatory cease and desist that would legally bar me from using my own office. She moved with a practiced, eerie stillness, stepping onto my grass to get a better angle. She was trespassing, stalking, and abusing her office all in one go. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't shout. I simply reached into my desk drawer and pulled out my Nikon with the 200mm telephoto lens, the one I'd used a decade ago to catch a CEO consulting at a golf course while his company went bankrupt. I waited. I watched her through the viewfinder as she adjusted the focus on her thermal kit. I waited for her to step under the spill of the street lamp at the edge of my driveway. Click whir. The digital shutter was silent, but the infrared flash I'd rigged caught the sharp, predatory lines of her face in perfect clarity. I had her. The president of the HOA, caught on camera at 2 a.m., trespassed onto a resident's lawn with surveillance equipment. The next morning, my front door was nearly obscured by paper. Becky had finally gone for the nuclear option, a formal notice of intent to foreclose for unpaid fines and egregious systemic non-compliance. It was a legal death sentence for my home ownership. I took a slow sip of my coffee, looking at the high-definition photo of Becky in the bushes on my screen, then back at the Apex Flow Shell Company records. She thought she was tightening the noose around my neck. She didn't realize that in her haste to hang me, she'd left the other end of the rope tied to a very heavy, very illegal chair. The notice of intent to foreclose wasn't just tucked into my doorframe, it was slapped onto the wood with an aggressive, almost spiteful amount of industrial duct tape. It was a bright red scarlet letter for the entire cul-de-sac to see, a public declaration that I was a deadbeat, a squatter in my own home. Becky wasn't just trying to find me anymore. She was trying to perform a legal lobotomy on my life. I spent Thursday morning in the quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary of the county courthouse. Most people think a lawsuit is about shouting in a courtroom, but as a forensic accountant, I knew the real war was won in the filing cabinet. I didn't just file a response to her fines. I filed a sprawling 68-page civil complaint that read like a post-mortem of a corrupt regime. The counts were heavy: breach of fiduciary duty, intentional infliction of emotional distress, fraud, and defamation per se. I named the Willow Creek HOA as a defendant, but the real sting was that I named Becky Williamson in her individual capacity. In the world of HOA law, board members are usually shielded by the business judgment rule, a legal umbrella that protects them from personal liability for honest mistakes. But that umbrella folds up and vanishes the moment you prove malice, self-dealing, or criminal intent. By 2 p.m., I had hired Marcus, a private process server who looked like he'd been carved out of a block of granite and possessed the relentless social grace of a bulldozer. I knew exactly where Becky would be: the Willow Creek Clubhouse, hosting her monthly Aesthetic Standards Committee high tea. Make sure she gets it while she's holding a teacup, I told Marcus, handing him the thick, blue-backed stack of legal documents. I want the whole committee to see the return address. I sat in my car at the far end of the parking lot, watching through my binoculars. 10 minutes later, Marcus strode into the clubhouse. Through the expansive, floor-to-ceiling French windows, the scene unfolded like a silent, high-stakes comedy. Becky was mid-sentence, likely lecturing a terrified new homeowner about the permissible shades of mulch when Marcus approached. She tried to wave him away with a flick of her manicured hand, her nose crinkling as if he were a bad smell. Marcus didn't budge. He stepped into her personal space, spoke 3 words, "You've been served," and tucked the heavy envelope directly into her silk-clad arm. The color didn't just leave Becky's face, it turned a muddy, bruised gray. She fumbled with the envelope, the papers spilling out onto the approved Persian rug. She caught sight of the first page, the one featuring the high-resolution photo of her standing in my bushes at 3 a.m. with a thermal monocular. She didn't just sit down. She practically collapsed into her rattan chair, her mouth hanging open in a silent, perfect O. The fallout was instantaneous. An hour later, my phone began to vibrate against the mahogany desk. It was the HOA's general counsel, a man named Henderson who sounded like he'd spent the last hour hyperventilating into a paper bag. "Mr. Jackson," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy, We've received your filing. It's highly irregular. $1 million claim for a few aesthetic disputes and some late-night inspections. Our insurance carrier is already balking. They've flagged the intentional malice and fraud allegations. They're claiming a total coverage exclusion. Do you realize what this does to the association's solvency?" "I realize exactly what it does, Henderson," I said, leaning back and propping my feet up on a stack of Becky's illegal fines. "It means Becky is on her own. The insurance won't pay for her stalking habit, and because the board ignored my 3 formal certified letters complaining about her harassment, the HOA is now legally her co-conspirator. You have 24 hours to produce the full unredacted ledgers for Apex Flow Solutions, or I move for an emergency injunction to freeze the HOA's accounts." There was a long, cold silence on the other end, punctuated only by the sound of Henderson's heavy breathing. She says you're making all of this up," Henderson whispered, his voice trembling with the weight of the disaster he was staring at. "She says you're a disgruntled suitor, that you're doing this because she rejected your advances." I didn't argue. Arguments are for amateurs. I clicked a button on my laptop and sent a single encrypted file to Henderson's email, a video clip from my security system showing Becky keying trash into the side of my mailbox while blowing a kiss toward my front door. "Check your inbox, Henderson. Then tell Becky that if she wants to play the boss, she better start practicing her testimony. I'll see her in Discovery." I hung up, walked out onto my porch, and sat in my rocking chair. I didn't care about the doormat. I didn't care that my lawn was a 1/4 inch over the limit. I just watched the sun set over the perfectly uniform rooftops of Willow Creek, knowing that the waves Becky had promised were finally turning into a tsunami, and it was heading straight for her clubhouse. Discovery is the part of a lawsuit that most people find tedious, a slow-motion paper war. But for a forensic accountant, it's like being handed the keys to a grand, neglected mansion and being told to find the hidden wall safes. By Monday morning, Henderson's voice on the phone sounded like he'd aged a decade over the weekend. He knew the HOA's insurance carrier had officially issued a reservation of rights letter. In the high-stakes world of liability, that's legal speak for, "If Becky did this on purpose, we aren't paying a cent and you're on your own." I spent the next 3 days in a windowless, over-air-conditioned conference room at Henderson's firm, surrounded by 64 boxes of Willow Creek's financial history. Becky had clearly tried to scrub the digital files, deleting emails and wiping server logs. But she didn't understand the fundamental rule of white-collar crime. Paper leaves a ghost. I started with the boring stuff. Line 16. Other miscellaneous administrative costs. In 2022, before Becky's election, that line item sat at a modest $4,200, mostly stamps, toner, and the occasional wreath for a deceased member. In 2024, the year Becky took over the presidency, it jumped to $7,500. I opened my laptop and cross-referenced the dates of those miscellaneous withdrawals with Becky's Instagram feed, which she had foolishly left public, clearly addicted to the likes from her fellow boss babes. It was a roadmap of theft. Every time an emergency administrative audit fee of $5,000 was logged, Becky was posting a high-definition photo of a mud wrap at a spa in Sedona or a leadership retreat at a five-star resort in Cabo San Lucas. Then, tucked at the bottom of a box labeled Pool Chemicals 2019, I found the fine ledger. It wasn't an official HOA document. It was a separate, spiraled notebook with a floral cover. In it, Becky had meticulously recorded every fine she'd ever issued, nearly $12,000 against me alone. But when I pulled the HOA's actual bank deposits, the numbers didn't match, not even close. She'd been instructing residents to pay their expedited fines via a third-party app or checks made out to Vance Consulting, her maiden name. She was running a private shakedown operation inside the HOA, using the community's legal power to fund her wardrobe. "Mr. Henderson," I said, leaning back and tapping a particularly damning invoice for a community perimeter structural reinforcement that supposedly cost $18,000. I'd checked the reinforcement on my morning walk. It was a pile of pressure-treated lumber sitting behind the maintenance shed, rotting in the rain. "Your client isn't just a stalker. He's a ghost employer. She's been billing the HOA for major repairs that never happened, using contractors that exist only as P.O. boxes." Henderson walked over, his face the color of unbaked dough. He looked at the invoice, then at the photo of Becky's brother-in-law's shell company registration I'd pinned to the table. "She told the board these were urgent foundation fixes to prevent a landslide," Henderson whispered, his hand trembling as he adjusted his glasses. "The board trusted her. They signed the checks in good faith." "Good faith doesn't stop a felony, Henderson," I said, my voice dropping into the cold, clinical tone I used when I was closing a case for the feds. "And because she used the U.S. mail to send these fraudulent fine notices and foreclosure threats to me and 40 other residents, this isn't just a civil dispute anymore. It's mail fraud. That's a federal racketeering charge. It's RICO territory." I pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper, a draft of my IRS Form 211. "If I file this, the IRS whistleblower office will come for the unpaid taxes on the $1.5 million Becky has skimmed and misclassified over the last 3 years. They will freeze every single asset this HOA has. They will put a lien on the clubhouse. The neighborhood will go into federal receivership. The pool will be drained. The security gates will stay open because there's no money for the electric bill. And Becky? She'll be trading her silk jogging suits for orange polyester." Henderson sat down heavily, the mahogany chair creaking under his weight. "What do you want, Cameron? We can't pay $1 million. We don't have it. If you enforce the judgment, the only way to pay you is to assess every homeowner $15,000. They'll lose their houses. You'll be the most hated man in the county." "I know you don't have the cash," I said, packing my laptop into my bag. "And I don't want to bankrupt my neighbors to pay for Becky's sins. I want a meeting, a public one. I want the 2-3 majority to hear exactly what their boss has been doing with their dues. And then I'm going to offer them a way out that doesn't involve $1 million assessment or a single cent from their pockets." I stood up, adjusting my tie. As I walked to the door, I turned back one last time. "Tell Becky to wear something comfortable for the meeting on Friday, and tell her to bring the ledger. It's time for the final audit." The notice for the emergency special assessment hit every doorstep in Willow Creek on Wednesday morning like a tactical strike. It was printed on blood-red paper, Becky's signature touch for critical alerts. Urgent, $15,000 mandatory levy per household due in 30 days. By noon, the neighborhood Facebook group was a digital lynch mob, and I was the target. Becky wasn't just hiding behind the numbers anymore. She was weaponizing the neighbors' fear of bankruptcy. She spent the afternoon holding court on her front lawn, a pitcher of lemonade in one hand and a stack of evidence folders in the other. I stood by my window, watching through the blinds as Phil and a dozen others gathered around her. Becky was in peak performance mode, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the part of the embattled protector. "I tried to protect us." Her voice drifted across the street, amplified by the heavy suburban silence. I spent months trying to get Mr. Jackson to follow the simple rules that keep our property values high. But he didn't move here to be a neighbor. He moved here to be a predator. She held up a grainy photo of me sitting in my darkened office, the blue light of my monitors illuminating my face. He's a forensic accountant, isn't he? He's spent his whole life tearing people apart for a living. He's been auditing our private lives from behind those blinds since the day he arrived. He's a voyeur, a litigious shark who set a trap for this community. Phil looked toward my house, his expression clouded with doubt. And let's be honest about why he's really suing, Becky continued, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial stage whisper that carried perfectly to my ears. He's a jilted, unstable man. When I turned down his aggressive, romantic advances, he snapped. He told me if I wouldn't be with him, he'd own this neighborhood. This $1 million lawsuit isn't about justice. It's about a man who can't handle the word no. He's trying to extort $15,000 from every single one of you because I wouldn't walk into his bedroom. A collective gasp went up from the circle. I felt a cold prickle of fury. It was a masterful lie, turning her own harassment back on me. By the time the sun began to set, my mailbox had been kicked over and someone had spray-painted Leech across my driveway in white primer. The phone rang. It was Phil. "Cameron," he said, his voice hushed and strained. "The street is losing its mind. Becky is telling everyone you've got a revenge file on every house in the creek. She says the only way to stop you from taking their savings is to pay the assessment and then sue you for defamation. Is any of it true?" "Phil," I said, leaning against my desk, looking at the spreadsheet that proved Becky had stolen enough to pay off 5 mortgages. "She's panicking. She's trying to burn the village so I can't rule the ashes. I don't want your money. I never did. But if I don't get a chance to speak at that meeting on Friday, Becky is going to walk away with your life savings while you're busy hating me. She's already tried to cancel the meeting, saying it's a safety risk because of your instability," Phil whispered. "But the bylaws say if 25% of us sign a petition, she can't stop it. I've got 20 signatures already. People are scared of you, Cameron, but they're more scared of that $15,000 bill." "Get the signatures, Phil," I said. "And tell everyone to bring their bank statements. I'm going to show them exactly whose pocket that money is really going into." I hung up and looked at the photo of Becky keying my mailbox. She thought she'd won the he said, she said battle by being the loudest voice in the cul-de-sac. She didn't realize that in a court of law, and in a room full of people about to lose $15,000, the loudest voice is always the one with the receipts. The following night, Willow Creek felt like a ghost town under a Black Ops blackout. No one was waving. No one was out walking their dogs. The only thing moving was the white Lexus, making slow, predatory loops through the cul-de-sac. Becky wasn't just patrolling. She was marking her territory. There was a faint, rhythmic scratching at my backsliding door. I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy mag light on my desk. I pulled back the heavy blackout curtains an inch. It was Phil. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in 48 hours, his windbreaker pulled up to his chin. I slid the door open just enough for him to slip inside. "The street is a powder keg, Cameron," he whispered, glancing nervously at the dark shadows of my backyard. "Becky's been going door to door since 6. She's telling everyone that if we don't pay the assessment by Friday, you're going to put a lien on every house. She's calling it the Jackson tax. She's a master of branding. I'll give her that," I said, pulling him into the kitchen where the only light came from the small glow of the stove clock. "Did you get the signatures?" Phil reached into his jacket and pulled out a crumpled, stained sheaf of papers. 28. It's exactly enough to trigger the special meeting under Section 9. But Becky's already trying to move the goalposts. She sent out an emergency board order an hour ago, claiming that because you've made threatening romantic advances toward her, the meeting has to be held via Zoom with you muted for safety reasons. I felt a cold, familiar spark of forensic fury. "She's trying to cut the mic before I can show the receipts," Phil, listen to me. If she mutes me, you lose 15 grand, every one of you. I walked him over to my mahogany desk. The monitors flickered to life, illuminating the room in a cold, clinical blue. I scrolled past the photos of Becky in the bushes and landed on a side-by-side comparison. The HOA's landscaping expenditure, and a private bank statement I'd managed to reconstruct through a vendor's leaked metadata. "This is Vance Consulting," I said, pointing to a series of $5,000 deposits. "That's Becky's maiden name. This money isn't going to $1 million settlement for me. It's already gone. She's been embezzling for years, Phil. My lawsuit just made the hole in the bucket too big to hide, so she's trying to make you lot fill it up before she skips town." Phil stared at the screen, his mouth falling open. "She told us she was a volunteer, that she was doing this out of the goodness of her heart." "She's doing it out of the goodness of your equity," I countered. "Here's the play. We don't do Zoom. The bylaws state the meeting must be held in a physical common area if requested by the petitioners. We hold it at the pool deck at 7:00 p.m. on Friday. Tell the others to bring their laptops and their phones. I'm going to broadcast the audit directly onto the clubhouse wall." "She'll call the police," Phil warned. "She's already filed a protection from harassment order against you." "Let her," I said, a grim smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "I've already sent a copy of this audit to the district attorney's white-collar unit. If the police show up, they won't be there to arrest me. They'll be there to escort the president to a different kind of gated community." Phil looked at me, the fear in his eyes slowly being replaced by a desperate kind of hope. "She's going to fight you, Cameron. She'd rather see this whole place burn than lose her grip." "Then we let it burn," I said. "And we build something better from the ashes. Get the word out, Phil. Tell them the Jackson tax just became a Williamson audit." As Phil slipped back out into the night, I sat in the dark, watching the white Lexus pass one more time. Becky thought she was playing a game of hearts and flowers. She had no idea she was about to be audited by a man who didn't believe in fairy tales, only in the cold, hard truth of a balanced ledger. The humidity was thick enough to choke on by Friday evening. The pool deck at the Willow Creek Clubhouse, usually a place of overpriced cocktails and hushed gossip, had been transformed into a suburban battleground. Under the flickering glow of the underwater lights, 80 homeowners sat in folding chairs, their faces illuminated by the blue glare of their smartphones. The air didn't smell like chlorine. It smelled like panic. Becky was already there, perched at a glass-topped table like a queen on a besieged throne. She was wearing a sharp white blazer, the color of innocence, and had a private security guard standing behind her. When I walked through the gate with my laptop bag and a portable projector, the silence was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a riot. "This meeting is out of order!" Becky shrieked, her voice cracking as she stood up. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "Mr. Jackson is under a temporary restraining order. He is a danger to me and to the moral fabric of this community. Security, remove him!" The guard took a step forward, but Phil stood up from the front row. Then Sarah, then 10 others. "The petition was legal, Becky," Phil said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Section 9 of the bylaws. We called this meeting. We want to hear what Cameron has to say about our $15,000. "He's a liar!" Becky screamed, her face contorting, the polished boss mask finally melting away to reveal the raw, jagged edges of her desperation. "He's doing this because I wouldn't sleep with him. He's trying to bankrupt you to punish me." I didn't say a word. I simply set the projector on a stack of lounge chair cushions and aimed it at the vast white stucco wall of the clubhouse. Click. The first slide appeared, a giant blow-up of Vance Consulting's bank records alongside the HOA's emergency maintenance ledger. "My name is Cameron Jackson," I said, my voice amplified by the portable PA system Phil had smuggled in. "And I don't want your money. In fact, if you look at the screen, you'll see that Becky Williamson has already taken it." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. I scrolled through the lapping scheme, showing how she'd moved money from the pool fund to cover the missing fine revenue, and how she'd billed $40,000 for a culvert clearing that was actually a down payment on a beach house in Florida. "He's faking the documents," Becky yelled, lunging toward the projector. Phil stepped in her way, his arms crossed. "I'm a forensic accountant, Becky," I said, my eyes locked on hers. "These are verified bank metadata files. I've already sent the originals to the district attorney. But here's the reality for everyone else. The HOA owes me $1 million because of Becky's targeted harassment. If you pay me, you lose your savings. If you don't pay me, the HOA goes into federal receivership because of the tax fraud I've uncovered." I looked out at the sea of terrified faces, people I'd barely spoken to, people who had spat on my driveway 48 hours ago. "But there is a third option," I said, my voice dropping. "A settlement agreement. I will waive the $1 million payout, every cent, on one condition. This community votes tonight, by a 75% supermajority, to release my property from the HOA's jurisdiction in perpetuity. I stay a member for the sake of the shared resources, but the CC&Rs will never apply to my lot again. No fines, no inspections, no Becky." The deck erupted. Becky was screaming, throwing aesthetic code binders at the crowd, her hair coming loose from its structural spray. "Becky!" Phil shouted over the din. "He's the only one offering to save our property values. You're the one who stole the paint money." The shouting lasted for an hour. People were crying, arguing, and staring at their bank apps. Becky's cronies, the 3 women who lived in her pocket, tried to block the vote, but they were drowned out by the sound of 80 people realizing they were being robbed by the woman in the white blazer. "Vote!" someone yelled. "Take the deal, Cameron. Just let us keep our money." I looked at Becky. She was slumped in her chair, her eyes darting around like a trapped animal. She knew. She had lost the ledger, the crowd, and the game. "Phil," I said, handing him the ballot box, "let's see if Willow Creek wants to be free." The silence that followed the ballot count was heavier than the humidity. Phil stood by the edge of the diving board, his hands trembling as he smoothed out the final scrap of paper. Becky sat 10 feet away, her white blazer stained with spilled Chardonnay, her eyes fixed on the flickering blue projection of her own bank records. She looked like a ghost haunting her own party. "The results are in," Phil announced, his voice cracking over the cheap PA system. "With 82 lots represented, we have 62 votes in favor of the settlement agreement and mutual release. That's 75.6%. A ragged cheer went up from the back rows, not a cheer of joy, but of profound, exhausted relief. People weren't celebrating me. They were celebrating the fact that they wouldn't have to explain a $15,000 hole in their savings to their spouses tonight. Becky lunged for the microphone, her face a mask of jagged fury. "It's illegal! You can't contract away the CC&Rs. I'll sue every one of you for breach of the master deed. I'm still the president." "Actually, Becky," I said, stepping into the light of the projector so my shadow loomed large against the clubhouse wall. Section 12 of the bylaws allows for the immediate removal of any officer convicted of a crime of moral turpitude. And while you haven't been convicted yet, the district attorney's white-collar unit is waiting in the parking lot. I'd say your presidency ended about 10 minutes ago." The blood drained from her face as 2 cruisers pulled up to the clubhouse gates, their silent blue and red lights reflecting off the surface of the pool. Becky didn't scream this time. She just withered. As the officers escorted her toward the gate, she looked back at me, not with hate, but with a terrifying, hollow confusion. She truly couldn't understand a world where her rules didn't protect her from the truth. The following Monday, I drove down to the county recorder's office. I sat in a quiet booth and watched the clerk stamp my settlement agreement and mutual release. Recorded, Book 402, page 118. It was a legal shield, a permanent "Do Not Disturb" sign woven into the very fabric of the land. My lot was now a sovereign island. I was still a member of the HOA, I'd keep paying my dues for the pool and the streetlights, but the aesthetic code was dead to me. When I got home, Phil was out on his lawn. He gave me a cautious, respectful wave. I waved back, then walked to my front door and did something I'd been dreaming of for weeks. I took out a screwdriver and removed the approved eggshell white mailbox. In its place, I installed a heavy industrial-grade black steel box with a flag that sat at a defiant 60-degree angle. Then I went inside and painted my foyer a deep, moody navy blue, a color Becky had once described as visually aggressive. Life in Willow Creek changed after that. A new board was elected with Phil as the interim head. The fine fund was abolished, replaced by a transparent ledger that anyone could audit at any time. The neighbors stopped looking at their phones when I walked by. They didn't exactly invite me to dinner, but they stopped measuring my grass. Sometimes in the evenings, I sit on my porch in my rocking chair. I watch the new residents move in, their faces full of that familiar suburban hope. Occasionally, I see them look at my house, at my non-conforming porch swing and my unauthorized wildflower garden, and I see the confusion in their eyes. I just sip my coffee and smile. I'm the forensic accountant who found the one thing money couldn't buy in a place like this. I found my peace. And in the middle of a world built on fine print and fences, I finally found a way to be free. 6 months have passed since the night the pool deck became a courtroom, and Willow Creek has settled into a new, quieter rhythm. The Becky era is now whispered about as a cautionary tale, a fever dream of mid-tier tyranny that finally broke under the weight of its own ledgers. My house remains the quiet anomaly of the neighborhood. I still pay my monthly dues, $215 for the sponge of shared roads and the clubhouse pool, but the settlement agreement and mutual release filed at the county recorder's office has held firm. My black steel 60-degree mailbox has become a local landmark. New residents sometimes pause to look at it, likely checking their digital handbooks for a rule that no longer applies to Lot 42. I recently painted my front door a shade of midnight navy that would have triggered a 3-alarm emergency under the old regime. Now it's just a door. Becky's trial is set for the autumn. After the IRS whistleblower office received my 211 filing, they didn't just audit the HOA, they audited Becky's personal Vance Consulting accounts. She is currently facing multiple counts of mail fraud and embezzlement. Her white Lexus was repossessed 3 months ago. Rumor has it she's living in a cramped apartment 2 towns over, likely driving the building manager insane with unauthorized balcony decor complaints. Phil is now the permanent board president. He runs the meetings with the weary efficiency of a man who just wants to get home to his family. Every Friday, the HOA whistleblower portal, a simple shared drive Phil set up, is updated with every receipt and bank statement from the week. The $1.2 million debt is gone, dissolved by the settlement. The neighbors who once spat on my driveway now occasionally drop off extra zucchini from their gardens. We aren't best friends, but there is a mutual, respectful distance, the kind of peace you only get when everyone knows the rules are fair. As for me, the adrenaline of the audit has finally faded. I spend my afternoons on my porch, rocking in a chair that isn't the approved teak. I watch the sunset over the roofs, no longer looking for stutters in the numbers or shadows in the bushes. I'm no longer the predator, and I'm certainly not the prey. I'm just a man in a house with a blue door, living a life that is, finally, entirely my own. And that's my story. Thanks so much for listening. If you liked it, I'd really appreciate you giving the video a like and the channel a subscribe. And if you want more HOA stories like this, drop a comment below and let me know what kind of stories you'd like to hear. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll hopefully catch you next time.